Yes. All right, welcome back for talk number 3, the final talk of day 1 with Matt Stein. Matt is a beloved friend and advocate to pretty much everybody in the craft community. His latest work on improving all of the documentation for the craft ecosystem has made craft accessible to more people than ever before. And he is an unfailingly kind, generous, and charming individual who is everywhere at once, always answering questions and lending helping hands.
Before he was Pixelantonic's tech writer-in-chief, he was an independent developer and had plenty of independent thoughts on one of Craft's most hotly discussed features, Project Config. In fact, by his own admission, he happily avoided Project Config until it became his job to write its official documentation. His journey turned him from skeptic to enthusiastic advocate.
So for our final talk of the day, Matt joins us now to share some of his thoughts and who knows, maybe even make some converts.
As before, please join the conversation in our Discord chat there in the Q&A channel or by hopping into the Zoom room, and you can find the links for those here on the watch page. Here is Matt.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending extendsConf. I hope you are having a really nice pandemic. My name is Matt Stein, and now that you've heard 2 good talks, I would like to talk with you about Project Config. This talk is geared towards skeptics, and as far as I know, you fall into one of 2 buckets. You may not know much about Project Config because you've ignored it. You didn't need it, never saw any reason to use it, and you have lived your life happily without ever adopting Project Config because you didn't need to. The other camp may have kept up with changes to Project Config, having an existing workflow that just doesn't work with it. You know how it works, but you've rejected it because it hasn't behaved how you've wanted it to at different points that you've looked at it, or you continue to have a workflow that just doesn't work well with Project Config, whatever that may be. The reason for my enthusiasm on the subject and excitement in wanting to talk about it comes with a disclaimer. I am the technical writer for Pixelantonic, meaning I work on craft documentation and guides and things that hopefully help describe what Craft CMS is and how you can work with it. And I've been a craft developer for much longer than that, designing and building client projects and plugins and just things in the Craftverse. But the reason for the disclaimer is that my talk it represents my weird views, needing to write documentation for a feature that as a craft developer, I happily avoided since it existed. This changed only more recently when I needed to write about it and help people understand how to use it, and I can't avoid it at that point. I adopted it for the purpose of needing to write about it, and in doing that, learned why I kind of like it, and what the pitfalls may be in getting into it. So I don't want to convince you that you should absolutely adopt a Project Config based workflow. I will insist that you understand how it works because there's no avoiding it, and to make a good decision about however you work with it or don't work with it, you need to understand how it works. You do you. I'm going to tell you what it was like for me to avoid it very successfully and then start relying on it. And my goal is that we all learn something and have a clearer picture of what Project Config is and can more confidently know how we are going to work with or around it. Let's start with what Project Config is. Project Config is a core feature that was added to Craft CMS in version 3.1 in January of 2019. So it's been around for a while. Its goal is to make it easier to sync craft configuration across environments. The reason we want to be able to more easily sync craft configuration across environments is because it gets more and more elaborate as a site's content needs grow and as the number of people working to develop a site grows. It does this by writing static YAML files that represent the current up-to-date state of Craft's configuration in a way that you can commit, version, merge, pull into another environment, and sync into that environment. Key point here being that you no longer have a dependency on passing around database dumps. So rather than build out a certain section or configure Craft a certain way and then pass off a database dump to somebody else, you can explicitly share YAML that represents that state that you can pull and sync. So Craft's database is still the source of truth in each environment, but with project config, it has the ability to look outside itself for an authoritative second opinion, sync those changes in, and completely avoid any need to deal with a database dump. Now, you may use project config and love it. You may be new to Craft and not know much about it, and you may be thinking, wow, that sounds great. That sounds wonderful. Why would there be skeptics of this? There are skeptics, and for good reason. The initial rollout of project config, not particularly smooth sailing for the people that leapt right in, and my impression is that the people that started using it immediately were people in teams that were willing to work with it, eager to work with it, even with its shortcomings, because they were already acutely feeling the pain of a database dump dependent workflow. And this at least helped alleviate some of that. Project config has also evolved over time, not just becoming more stable, but changing in ways that make it more usable and more flexible and more realistic to work with. So at any point in its evolution, there may have been people that tried it and it did not work very well for them. My initial reaction to project config was how you might react when a bird flies into a window. Kind of landed with a thud, and I assumed everybody was okay. And got back to work. So one challenge is that people may have either ignored project config or jumped right in at some point and not had things go very smoothly. Another thing that can be challenging about project config is that it can be sort of difficult to talk about. And the reason is that as a feature, it actually encapsulates three distinctly separate things. The first of these things is the YAML that gets written locally as you update Craft's configuration in the control panel, and it diligently records each change that you make in these YAML files. It's the part you're most likely to see and notice immediately and think of when you think of project config. The second facet of project config are settings and commands. There are general config settings and there are console commands and controller actions that work together to describe how project config will behave and when. This is an important part that I missed when I was first looking into it and managed to miss repeatedly, is that project config never, ever, ever changes your Craft configuration without you explicitly deciding to bring in changes. Even if you update your deployment process to have project config automatically bring in changes, it's not really happening automatically. You are adding a console command to your deployment process to explicitly say, whatever changes are here, pull them in, sync them into this environment. The most that Craft will ever do is notify you that there seems to be a difference between the source of truth of configuration in the database and what's represented in the YAML. And it will prompt you to deal with that in some way. And you use settings and commands to control how and when that happens. You've probably encountered the third thing if you write your own plugins or you've written a module or anything that stores Craft configuration settings, and that is the project config API. Even if you haven't done those things, the project config API is running under the hood all the time because all of Craft's configuration goes through the project config API. If you disabled project config at some point, or if you ignored its YAML, or you think you've gotten away with avoiding project config, secretly you are wrong because it's always there. It's always running. As long as Craft needs configuration, it's getting it through the project config API. It's not something you can turn off or disable because it's there running under the hood whether you like it or not. So it's important when you're talking or thinking about project config to consider the context that you're describing it in, because that may be its YAML, that may be the settings and commands, and that may be its API. So before I describe what life looks like with Project Config, let me tell you how I worked without it and before it. This is probably similar to how you work, and maybe you have a more sophisticated version of doing the same thing. But ultimately, for me, production is the source of truth for everything, or at least for the database. It was the one database where the only rule is you never overwrite production. That includes whether you're making updates to the schema or updating Craft or any plugins. You would always run things in production, but never, ever, ever overwrite that database. I would always pull it down into staging or into a local environment, but again, never overwrite it. That's challenging because when you go to add, say, a new section, you need to develop, templates and things to go with it. So there has to be some relationship between the sections and the field layouts and that content schema configuration that you're setting up and the parts of the site that you're developing. I solved this in one of two ways, depending on how permissions worked in the control panel and how complicated the section or the feature is. So when I say feature, I'm talking about developing templates that coordinate with new fields and new data that lives in the database. The first way that I might handle that is to create whatever sections, field layouts, fields, whatever, that I need in the control panel in production. Hopefully the client doesn't have admin permissions and I can hide that until we're ready to launch it. I would then pull that down locally, develop whatever templates I need to support it, and then push everything to production and just make those more visible once the part of the site is ready. That's one way I would handle it. The other, if it's maybe a more complicated feature or something I'm just trying out and we're not sure if we're going to want it to end up in production, maybe it's a section of a site that the client's interested in, but we kind of want to play with it a little bit and may or may not actually end up using it. Then I would create everything locally, maybe work in a different branch or whatever, and then create a list of notes for myself. So whatever fields I created, whatever the field instructions are, all the details, the field handles, make a diligent little to-do list for reproducing those things in production, should we use it. Or if it was much more elaborate, and I kind of like doing this, and I'm getting the impression that's a problem because most people don't, I would write content migrations. So that I could write code that would create whatever content schema we would need, maybe even insert content or something like that, maybe migrate content. I like writing them, but when things are complicated enough, it sometimes warrants it. And so then it would be sort of like how Project Config works now, in that you push those changes to production, you explicitly run the content migrations, and then it creates the new stuff as your templates are also hitting production. So as an orderly way to do it, that could be kind of tedious. And I think most people would say it's awful and tedious, and why would you ever want to write content migrations, Matt? What's wrong with you? Either way, what I'm doing is finding a way to let production and my local environment be separate, but have some way of updating production when it's time. It's probably worth pointing out, both before and after Project Config, I've been automating deployments. It's made life easier for some time now, but the idea is that in each publicly hosted environment, the server is listening for changes on certain Git branches. It pulls those changes in, runs composer install, runs migrations, and basically does the things that it needs to update Craft or plugins or whatever, or templates or anything that's coming from Git. That's life without Project Config. And that worked well for me. There was nothing wrong with it. I don't tend to work with a lot of other developers on projects. I completely understand how database-driven or database dump-driven feature development works. Never really had huge problems with it, so I didn't see why life with Project Config would be even necessary, and definitely not given all the early bugs and challenges that it brought with it. Then, I needed to write about how it works, so I tried it in a project. Totally got it wrong and hosed things, and I'm gonna come back to that with lessons learned. But when Project Config is working, it's pretty nice. Instead of always treating the production database as the source of truth, it's only the source of truth for content. I still never overwrite it, but anytime I would develop a feature now, I would do that locally, and create the field layouts fields again, the content schema that I need, and then get this very clean YAML automatically that explicitly says what fields were added or created or changed. I can take my time with it and do things like perfect field instructions and things that I'm not going to have to reproduce them in production. But I work on the templates and the configuration changes, and those get committed together. And those can go to staging where, if we decide not to use the thing, it can just die and it never touches production, or it can end up in production. I made one change to my deployments, which is just to automatically apply any project config that comes in, and it works pretty well. It takes away any need to write content migrations. After the first site that I just bombed my way through, after I understood how to use it, turns out I like it. I prefer it. All of the projects that I still maintain are now using it, and I feel good about that. This is probably the hardest sell I will try to make, and really these are my honest feelings about using it. I really, really like that I have an explicit history of changes. It's true that you could delete a whole section or something and pull that. If you've automated your deployments and automatically sync changes in, you could wipe out a section or something like that. You could also do that by clicking around the control panel and deleting a section. There's still wrong ways to do things, but I like that at least if the wrong thing was done, you would have an explicit record of exactly what that was with whoever committed it and when it happened. And if you've automated your deployments, you probably have an exact record of also when that happened in production. So even the wrong thing is done with a little bit more specificity, and I like that. Speaking of allow admin changes, I of course followed the best practice because, learning, turned off allow admin changes in production. At first, this was really awkward because I'm used to going to production to make changes. It turns out it's fine. Turning that off is a good way to train yourself to be making changes locally, but it's also a little bit of a grace. I'm sure none of you do this. I'm sure none of you have needed to give clients full admin access to the control panel because they felt like they should have it, even though in your heart they should not, because they will break something someday. And you go to sleep at night and you do your best to just not think about that. Turning off allow admin changes in production solves that problem. No, you can't go there to make the same changes that you could make locally, but now you're limiting basic and kind of critical system configuration changes to developers that would need to commit stuff. To me, that is a good thing, and I sleep better with that being the case. And I think it also makes sense. Production is where content changes, and anything else, templates or you wouldn't be editing templates in production, hopefully, right? You don't do that. Don't tell me if you do that. You wouldn't edit templates in production. You wouldn't edit your general config file in production. Why would you also randomly add sections or delete fields or whatever else there? It just kind of makes sense to be doing those things locally like you would every other part of Craft's configuration. I kind of mentioned already that I like the more careful schema customization. If I go to create a field and write a field instruction, I don't skip it knowing that I'll add it later in production when we're serious. I get it right the first time, and that's nice. Maybe that's just me, but it just feels more orderly and puts my attention in the right place to change the configuration once and focus on getting it right. Feature rollouts also feel more orderly. So far, Project Config, after the first site that I bombed, Project Config has yet to disappoint me or do anything weird or even have some kind of odd bug. Every feature rollout, as a result, I know I can trust it, or so far I feel very confident that I can trust it. Every feature rollout feels pretty cool because the templates and the configuration hit the site at the same time, and it just is orderly and instantaneous and pretty cool. But I like that the schema that I've already thought out and tested and everything goes with the templates, and deploying new changes is actually pretty fun. And lastly, I haven't figured out how to take advantage of this yet, but I've started writing tests for projects and plugins. It's really cool that you can use the same YAML to spin up a site, and that can be even using a different database engine. So the YAML is database agnostic. When Craft reads it and interprets it and syncs in its changes, it can do that in Postgres, it can do that in MySQL, and it can do that pretty much immediately, which will be useful in testing, to be able to spin up a specific site configuration and test with that. So that's why I like Project Config. Okay, so maybe you're kind of thinking about it. Maybe you're still on the fence, you're not sure if it's gonna add anything to your life, but you've been holding out, waiting for it to at least get more stable and know that it's worth your time to invest, trying to make sense of it and do something with it. If that's you, As of Craft 3.5 this past August, the time has come. Not only is it much more stable, and that's been improving since it was released, because I think that's how things work. It includes features in the control panel that improve its usability. So you can actually see one cohesive diff of the current loaded project config and then whatever the YAML is showing. You can get some sense before applying any changes what would happen. Craft will alert you to changes, prompt you with how to handle them. Just overall usability translates to more confidence in knowing what will happen if you push a button. I think nothing's more terrifying than the idea of just blindly running a thing and knowing it'll change your site's configuration but not knowing what'll happen. As of Craft 3.5, that's less of a concern, if it is at all. Craft will help identify what changes are waiting and prompt you for what to do with them. And it has been reliable. And don't take my word for it. I mean, ask around. So that's what life looked like for me before Project Config and after adopting it as part of my workflow. I am using it happily now. Nobody's making me say this. I wouldn't be giving this talk if I didn't have positive feelings about it. And okay, Pixel and Tonic guy says Craft CMS feature is good. That's not a headline. Who cares? If I was listening to the same talk, I don't want to say how long ago, but real recently, I would see the place that I'm in now may be a benefit to using it, but the large unaddressed area is how to get from where I am to that. If this is you on your bicycle, staring into the storm cloud that could be Project Config, I think you're right. For me, the hardest part by far of working with Project Config was taking a project where I was not using it or relying on it and shifting into integrating it into my workflow and relying on it. So if you're staring ahead wondering what to do, let me give you some advice that would have saved me a fair amount of failure that also resulted in some learning and apparently a talk. These are the two most important things I can offer you. The first thing, give yourself a moment and consider what is changing. There is a very important shift that's happening when you go from everything living in production and being pulled down to making changes locally to configuration that you push up. Just let that stew, take it in, and appreciate that that is what is happening, because it's going to be a change to your workflow. This will matter, especially if you work in a team, and even if you work on your own, it's going to change how you do things. If you're not already automating deployments, it'll maybe be even a little bit weirder. It'll give you an extra step. There are lots of ways that if you don't stop and acknowledge this first, you can do it wrong. I probably did all of them because I totally skipped the step and just enabled it and banged some YAML together in production, and Craft was, understandably like, okay. Think about it. Just take a moment to acknowledge the shift that's happening. And the second one is start with everything in sync. You are already probably very good at using production as the single source of truth for content and schema and everything and pulling that database down. Do that once for every environment. The reason for this is pretty simple, and it's that Project Config is using UIDs under the hood to determine whether two things are different. So if in each environment you've recreated a section by hand, and in each environment that got different UIDs, putting those things together is going to result in something weird. So start once, make sure that everything is absolutely consistent, that all configuration is totally consistent in every environment before you're using that configuration to generate YAML, which you are then sharing among those environments. Both of these things are now covered in the documentation, and I cannot emphasize enough. Follow the steps. Consider the change that's involved for your workflow, because yours may look different from mine, and start with everything in sync. This is not something that you should either ignore or adopt without thinking about how it's going to impact your workflow. That is the catch with Project Config. You need to understand how it works before you decide to ignore it or decide to work with it. Otherwise, you'll end up fighting it, and it's uncomfortable. Which leads me to my final point. Even if you are not going to embrace Project Config or you're happy with your current workflow, you have to decide what you're going to do with it. And the only way you can do that is by understanding how it works. In the documentation on the project config page, we used to have, until very recently, like this week, there was a section that was called opting out. And it told you how to add the project config's YAML folder to your gitignore file, which is the equivalent of saying, I'm not going to use this, let Craft babble all at once over here, and let it write all its YAML and do its thing, and I'm just going to ignore it. More recently, that we got rid of that title because it's misleading, and some things changed under the hood that actually make it easier to opt out, really. But the problem with the phrase opting out is you cannot fully and truly opt out of project config because it's running under the hood, whether you like it or not. It's that third thing. It's those APIs that all configuration goes through. But as of this last release, you can tell project config not to write YAML, which would not have been a problem that was solved with the gitignore method. You can tell project config not to write its YAML at all. And if you go down that route, that'll also change how Craft reports how it sees changes in the control panel and how it displays diffs and what it considers the source of truth. You have a greater ability now than you have at any other point in controlling exactly how project config behaves, but there is no such thing as opting out. There is no path forward where you can fully ignore project config and expect never to encounter it again. So my best advice would be to take a moment, consider how it works, figure out what it is that you will do with it and how that will impact your workflow, and consider not fighting it. That's my talk. Thank you for listening, and good luck.